The winter of 1879 nearly swallowed Matilda Carter whole, and she had the scars, both the kind you could see and the kind you could not, to prove it. She had come to the high plains of Wyoming Territory on the back of a promise that turned to ash before the first hard frost arrived. Her husband, George Carter, had painted the picture in broad, gleaming strokes back in Ohio. A homestead already half built, a cattle operation already half running, a future already half made. What she found when the wagon finally rolled to a stop at the edge of the Laramie foothills was a single-room structure barely fit for a dog, a field that had never been broken, and a man who had never fully intended to do the breaking. George Carter had good hands for stories and poor hands for everything else, and the distance between his imagination and his effort had always been exactly the distance between the life he promised and the life he delivered. Still, Matilda had pulled her wool coat tighter and set about making something from the almost nothing he had given her. She had always been that kind of woman, the kind who looked at a ruin and saw architecture. Back in Cincinnati, her mother had called her stubborn, and her father had called her practical, and both of them had been describing the same quality from different angles. She planted a kitchen garden in what remained of summer. She patched the roof herself with cedar shingles she bargained for at the trading post in Laramie City. She learned to fire the cast iron stove so precisely that the small space held warmth against all reasonable odds. Then November came. George had ridden toward town on the 7th of November, 1879, on an errand Matilda later discovered had nothing to do with supplies and everything to do with a card game he had no business sitting down to. He never came back. Not because anything dramatic took him, no outlaws, no ambush, nothing that might have at least made the story worth telling. He simply chose, somewhere between the saloon on Front Street and the homestead on the hill, not to return. She received word through a neighbor named Harris who passed by the road in mid-December that George Carter had boarded a southbound stage with a woman from the gaming house and was reported to be heading toward Colorado. So Matilda was alone with a half-built homestead, a failing cattle operation that amounted to 4 thin cows and a sway-backed mule, and a Wyoming winter that was being described by the old-timers in town as the worst in 15 years. The temperature dropped in ways that felt personal. Snow packed against the north wall of the cabin until it climbed to the level of the single window, and the interior went permanently gray. The well froze. The smaller of the 4 cows died on the night of December 23rd, and Matilda dragged the carcass clear of the barn by herself in the dark, because she could not afford to let the others catch whatever sickness had taken it. She did not cry about the cow. She had already used up crying on George somewhere around week 3 of his absence, and she had learned quickly that tears were not a useful currency in this territory. She ate carefully, rationing the dried beans and the smoked pork and the hard-tack biscuits she had stored. She kept the stove burning through the nights, feeding it in 2-hour intervals and sleeping in her coat because the wool blanket she had was not quite enough. She talked sometimes out loud to no one, or maybe to herself, or to the wind that rattled the wooden walls, or to whatever force had arranged the facts of her life into this particular shape. She said things like, "You are still here, and one more morning," and once in the deep dark of January, "You are not going to let this be the end." She was 24 years old, and she had survived a man's abandonment and a Wyoming winter, and she arrived at the first week of February thin and hollow-eyed, but absolutely, categorically alive. The snow began to ease in late February, and the road that ran through the valley below the homestead began to show its ruts again. It was on a pale-skied Thursday morning, the kind of morning where the cold had softened just enough to let you forget for a moment what it had been, that Matilda first saw Owen Keene. He was coming up the road from the south, riding a bay horse with good strong legs and an honest gait, and he had a pack horse following behind him on a lead rope. He wore a dark coat and a well-worked hat, and he rode with the kind of ease that came not from arrogance but from 10,000 miles of practice. He was a man of perhaps 28 or 29, broad through the shoulders in the way that suggested actual labor, with a jaw that held a week of dark beard and eyes that, when he finally looked up toward the homestead and saw her standing at the edge of the porch, were a clear and steady shade of brown. He raised a hand. Not a wave exactly, more of an acknowledgement, the way you might nod at someone across a room when you recognize their right to be there. Matilda did not move. She watched him. She had learned through the winter to read approach, whether a person was riding with purpose or with wandering, whether their posture carried intent. This man was riding with purpose, but the purpose appeared to be simply forward motion, not anything aimed at her specifically. Still, she kept her hand near the rifle she had left leaning against the porch post. He slowed when he reached the property line, which was marked by nothing more than a fence post with a rusted hinge on it, the fence itself having never been built. He stopped his horse and looked at her with an expression that was not intrusive, just direct. "Morning," he said. His voice carried across the distance easily, deep and unhurried. "Morning," Matilda said. "I'm not looking for trouble, just wondering if you've got water. My canteen froze up last night and I haven't found a running source since the creek back on the Miller Road." She looked at him for another moment, measuring. Then she said, "Well, came back yesterday. Come through the gate." He dismounted before he came through, which she noted. He did not ride onto her property on horseback. He led his animals in on foot, respectfully, as if he understood that land belonged to whoever was standing on it. That was a quality she filed away without quite naming it. She worked the hand pump while he held both canteens and then a collapsible canvas bucket for the horses. He did not fill the bucket himself, did not presume to use her pump as his own, but when she gestured to it and said, "Go ahead," he pumped without making a show of chivalry or a show of anything else. He was simply efficient and calm, and she found it unexpectedly pleasant to be near someone who was neither frantic nor false. "Owen Keene," he said when the horses had drunk. "Matilda Carter, you're running this place on your own." "I am." He looked at the homestead without the expression of pity or disbelief she had come to expect from people passing through, the ones who could not reconcile the idea of a woman standing alone on 40 acres. He looked at it the way you looked at a thing that was real and accounted for, a fact that required no commentary. "Road up ahead is still bad past Elk Creek," he said. "Drifts across the path. I might not make Laramie City today. Is there a place I could shelter tonight? I'll sleep in your barn if you've got one, and I'll pay in labor if you need work done. I don't take charity and I don't offer it, just trade." It was that last part, the clear, even declaration that he operated on terms of exchange rather than obligation, that made her trust him enough to say yes. "Barns around back, 2 cows and a mule inside, so watch your step. The stovepipe on the south side needs clearing if you want to start there." "I'll start there," he said, without hesitation. Owen Keene cleared the stovepipe that afternoon with a brush he had in his pack, which she thought was either a coincidence or a sign that he moved through the world prepared for what other people needed. He also patched a gap in the barn's north wall with boards he found in a pile near the tool shed, not because she asked, but because he saw it needed doing. He worked quietly and steadily, and when evening fell he sat on the porch step and did not come inside until she opened the door and said supper was ready. She had made a thick bean stew with the last of a ham hock and some dried onion, and there was hard cornbread she had made that morning before she knew she would have company. She set 2 plates at the small table near the stove, and they sat across from each other in the warmth and ate, and it was the first meal she had shared with another human being since October. "You been out here all winter?" he asked. "Yes." He looked at her, not with pity. She kept watching for pity and not finding it. "That's something," he said. "It's just time passing," she said. "You get through a day and then you get through another one. Most people don't think of it that way. Most people have more options than I did." He ate for a moment, then said, "What happened to the rest of whoever was supposed to be here?" She told him briefly, in the flat, factual tone she had adopted as Armor George, the promise, November, the card game, the southbound stage. She kept her voice level. She had told the story exactly once before to Harris the neighbor when he came to bring the news, and that time she had not cried, and she did not cry now either. Owen Keene listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That was a sorry thing for a man to do." "Yes," she said, "it was. You don't sound angry." "I burned through angry in December. I'm past it." He nodded. He seemed to understand that there were forms of suffering that moved through stages the way a season did, and that trying to place someone back in an earlier stage, just because it was where you expected them to be, was a useless exercise. He slept in the barn that night on his bedroll and was already working when she came out in the morning, having identified that the fence along the south pasture was down in 2 places and having begun the work of resetting the posts. She brought him coffee, real coffee, which she had been hoarding, and he accepted it with both hands and looked at her over the rim of the tin cup with those steady brown eyes and said, "Thank you." "Thank you," she said, "for the fence. Still a fair trade." He stayed 3 days. The road to Laramie City opened up enough on the 3rd afternoon, but he finished resetting the fence posts and replaced a broken hinge on the barn door and split a cord of firewood that he stacked neatly against the cabin's east wall before he loaded his horses and prepared to go. Matilda stood on the porch and watched him with an expression she was careful not to examine too closely. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Laramie City for now. Then probably up toward Cheyenne, see if there's ranch work." She nodded. "Well, you're a good worker." He had already put his boot in the stirrup, but he paused with his weight half lifted and looked at her. "You going to be all right out here?" "I have been so far." He studied her for a moment, and there was something in the way he looked careful, as if he was measuring a distance he wasn't sure he had the right to cross. "I'll be in Laramie City a few days before I head north. If you have need of supplies or anything that requires a second pair of hands, you could send word to the telegraph office. I check there." It was a practical offer, and she accepted it practically. "All right." He rode down the hill, and she watched him go until the road bent and the trees took him, and she told herself it was the cold that made her chest feel tight. She did send word, 2 weeks later, not for supplies but because a dispute had arisen with a man named Garrett Dole who claimed the eastern 40 yards of her property line was his by virtue of a survey he had commissioned, a survey that Matilda believed was fraudulent. She sent the message through Harris, who was making a trip to town anyway, and she wrote simply that if Owen Keene was still in Laramie City, she would appreciate his company if he could ride out. He arrived the following Tuesday. She was surprised by how easy it was, seeing him come up the road again. Her body did not tighten with wariness the way it did when strangers approached. Instead, something in her simply recognized him, the way you recognized weather or a sound you had known for a long time. "Tell me about this survey dispute," he said, before he even fully dismounted. She told him. He listened with the same focused attention he had given her the first time she spoke, not nodding impatiently, not interjecting, just listening with his whole body turned toward her the way most people only did in the first few minutes of a conversation before they started composing their response. He listened all the way through, and then he said, "Have you got your original land grant paperwork?" She had it. She had kept it in the tin box under the floorboards where George had put it, and she had not touched it in months, because looking at the land grant meant thinking about what the land had cost her and what it still owed, and she was not always ready for that. But she pulled it out, and Owen spread it on the table with his broad hands and studied it alongside the rough copy of Dole's survey with the seriousness of a man who had dealt with boundary disputes before and understood what they could do to a person who was not careful. "This survey of his was done by a man named Crowell," Owen said, tapping the paper. "I know that name. He's done work for 3 different ranchers up in the Carbon County area, and 2 of those boundary lines later turned out to be shifted in the rancher's favor. He's not working for the land, he's working for whoever's paying him. Can we prove that? We can challenge it. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne has the original government survey from the 1874 mapping. If your lines match that survey, which I believe they do based on these markers here, then Dole hasn't got a legal foot to stand on. Cheyenne is 2 days' ride. Yes, he said. He looked at her steadily. I'll go if you want. You give me the paperwork, I'll ride to Cheyenne and file the challenge and bring back the copy of the territorial survey. She looked at him across the table. Why? He seemed briefly uncertain what she meant, and then he understood. Because it's the right thing. You don't know me. I know enough, he said simply. And then, quieter, you kept yourself alive through the worst winter in 15 years with 4 cows and a broke-down cabin and a man who didn't deserve the ground you stood on. You don't deserve to lose 40 yards of your own land to a crooked surveyor on top of that. She pressed her lips together. She did not cry. She had not cried in months, and she was not going to start now, but she felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been locked in a tight fist since November beginning very slowly to open. I'll pay you, she said. You will not. Owen. Matilda. He said her name with the same directness he applied to everything, and hearing it in his voice, her own name, spoken without the condescension George had sometimes used, and without the strained politeness of strangers, felt oddly steadying. Let me do this. You can pay me in coffee when I get back. He rode to Cheyenne that same week. He was gone 5 days, and during those 5 days, Matilda found herself listening for horses on the road more than she should have, more than made logical sense. She told herself it was because the land dispute was unresolved, and she needed the information he was bringing. She told herself she would listen for anyone carrying important news with the same attention. She was mostly convincing. He came back on a Friday evening just before dark, riding fast down the hill road with the packhorse trailing behind, and he had the territorial survey copy rolled in a leather tube strapped to his saddle. He brought it inside and laid it on the table, and there, plain as daylight, were the original 1874 government survey markers that matched Matilda's land grant exactly and put Garrett Dole's claimed 40 yards clearly inside her property line. You file this with the county clerk and Dole's got nothing, Owen said. She looked at the survey for a long moment. Then she looked at him, at the dust on his coat from the road, the tiredness around his eyes that he was carrying like a man who had ridden hard and eaten little, and the small, careful satisfaction in his expression that was not pride exactly but something adjacent to it, the look of a person who has done a thing correctly. Sit down, she said. I'll make supper. He sat. They ate together again, and this time the conversation ran long and easy, moving from the land dispute to his years working cattle drives up from Texas in the early years before the trail routes shifted, to her years in Cincinnati teaching school before she married George, to the particular quality of Wyoming sky at night that neither of them had ever seen anywhere else, the density of stars. The way the dark was not the same dark you found in the East, but something deeper and more absolute, and somehow friendlier for it. He told her he had grown up in Kansas, in a family that had homesteaded when he was 6 years old, and that he had 3 brothers and 2 sisters scattered across the territory now, none of them having stayed in one place. He told her his father had died of pneumonia when Owen was 18, and that he had spent the years since moving through the land taking whatever work was honest cattle, fencing, hauling freight, a season working for the Union Pacific before he decided he was not built for being underground. She listened to all of it with the same attention he gave to her words, and she noticed that he spoke about hard things without making himself small in the telling or inflating himself into something larger either. He was simply honest in the way that people who have lived closely with actual difficulty tended to be honest without performance, without self-pity, without the need to arrange the facts into anything more flattering than what they were. You haven't asked me, she said, somewhere past the second cup of coffee. Asked you what? What I plan to do with the homestead, whether I'm going to stay or sell and go back east. Everyone asks. He was quiet for a moment. Your business. You're curious, though. Yes, he admitted, but curious isn't the same as entitled. She looked at the fire through the stove's iron grate, the small amber light of it warm against the dim of the room. "I'm staying," she said. "I didn't survive that winter to hand it to someone else. This land is mine. I earned it in ways that have nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with what it cost me." Owen was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I know." She looked at him. The firelight was on his face, and in the simple, direct way he was looking back at her, she saw something that she recognized but was not ready to name, something that she suspected he recognized too and was being equally careful with, for which she was grateful. They were both, she understood, people who did not move toward things carelessly. They understood that some things once chosen could not be unchosen. He did not stay in the barn that night. There was another storm coming, a late March bluster that was not the killing cold of January but was still cold enough to be unpleasant. So she gave him the blanket from the trunk she had been saving, and he slept on the floor near the stove. In the morning when she woke, he was already up and had stoked the fire, and he had put on the coffee without asking, and she stood in the doorway of the sleeping corner in her coat and looked at the domestic, ordinary ease of him in her kitchen and thought, almost without intending to, "This is what it is supposed to feel like." The thought frightened her enough that she said nothing, just poured her coffee and stood at the window and looked at the land while the storm rolled through. When the storm cleared, he made to leave again, and again she found herself on the porch watching him pack his horse, and this time she said, before she could stop herself, "You could stay." He went still with his hand on the saddle cinch. He did not turn around immediately. She felt heat rise in her face in the cold air. "I mean," she said carefully, "there is work here. Real work. I cannot run this operation alone and have it be anything more than subsistence. And you're a man who works. I'm not offering charity. I would pay you a wage and you could use the barn for shelter. It's a fair arrangement." He turned around then, and he was looking at her in that careful way again, the one that was measuring distance but also, she thought, hoping it was not as far as it appeared. "A wage," he said. "Yes." "And the barn." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze because she was Matilda Carter, and she did not flinch from things, not anymore, not after the winter she had survived. And then something in his expression shifted, softened, maybe, or settled. The way a piece of ground settles when the weight it has been holding is finally distributed properly. "All right," he said. He stayed. The spring of 1880 came in slowly and then all at once, the way Wyoming spring always did, a week of false warmth and then a cold snap, and then finally, in earnest, the mud and the green and the enormous light that made the whole territory look like it was being seen for the first time. Matilda broke ground on a second garden bed, while Owen repaired the fencing that the winter had damaged, and they worked within sight of each other most days, moving in parallel rhythms that felt, without either of them remarking on it, natural. They talked constantly. That was the thing that surprised Matilda most about Owen Keene. Not his capability, which she had expected, but his curiosity. He asked her things. He asked what she had taught in Cincinnati, and then he asked what she had liked about teaching, and then he asked what specific things she missed and what she did not, and he listened to every answer with the seriousness of a man building a real understanding rather than just filling silence. She had not had a conversation of that depth with a man since her father, and even then there was a quality in Owen's attention that was different, equal, she thought. He spoke to her as if her thoughts had the same weight as his, which was not a thing she had been given often by the men in her life, and she found that it made her want to give him the most honest, complete versions of herself that she had. She told him about Cincinnati, the schoolroom on Broad Street with the long windows, the way 30 children's voices sounded when they were all reading aloud at the same time, a kind of organized chaos that she had found deeply satisfying. Her parents' house with the blue painted shutters, the roses her mother grew along the back fence. The way she had believed at 21 that marrying George Carter was choosing forward motion because he was charming and loud, and the world seemed to agree that charming and loud meant promising. Owen listened to all of it. He told her about the drives, about the particular loneliness of sleeping under the open sky for 60 consecutive nights, and the way loneliness and freedom occupied the same space out there. How you could not have one without the other, and had to decide which one to weight more heavily on any given day. He told her about a friend he had made on the trail, a man named Daltrey from Louisiana, who could play a mouth harp so well that the cattle would quiet themselves at night when he played, and who had died of a fever outside of Dodge City in 1876, and about how Owen had carried that grief without a place to put it for a long time, because on a cattle drive there was no room for stopping. "You carry a lot of things quietly," she said, one evening in early May while they sat on the porch watching the sky go pink over the western hills. "I suppose I do," he said. "Is that something you chose or something that happened to you?" He thought about it, really thought, which she had come to love about him, the way he did not deflect difficult questions with quick answers. "Both, I think. When you grow up with a lot of people in a small space, you learn early that your feelings are one more thing the house has to make room for, and sometimes it can't. So you learn to keep them, and then later you keep them because it becomes the way you are." "Do you ever wish you hadn't?" she asked. He looked at her. "I'm starting to," he said. The words were quiet and careful, but she heard everything underneath them clearly. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked back at the pink and amber western sky, and she did not say anything, and he did not say anything, and the air between them was full of something warm and patient, and not yet ready to be spoken but not afraid to exist. He kissed her for the first time on the 14th of June, 1880, which she remembered with the precision of someone who had long since stopped taking ordinary days for granted. They had been to Laramie City to file the finalized paperwork on the boundary dispute. Garrett Dole had backed down when faced with the territorial survey, muttering something about errors in his own man's work, and the case had been settled in Matilda's favor without needing to go before a judge. She had signed the final confirmation documents at the county clerk's office with Owen standing beside her, and when she came out onto the wood-planked sidewalk with the signed copy in her hand, she had felt something close to triumph. Not the loud, fist-in-the-air kind, but the quiet, hard-won kind that lives in the bones. They had a proper meal at the hotel dining room, which was a luxury she allowed herself perhaps twice a year. And Owen had ordered the steak, and she had ordered the roasted chicken, and they had sat at a table with a white cloth and talked about what they were going to do with the North Field once the summer was properly established. On the ride home, with the evening coming in purple and gold around them and the horses moving at an easy trot on the familiar road, he reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. Just that, her hand, warm in his, riding home under the enormous Wyoming sky. She did not pull away. She held on. When they came to the homestead and dismounted and she turned to take the reins from him to lead the horses in, he was standing close, and when she looked up his face was just there, steady and warm, and he said, "Matilda," and she said, "Yes," not as a question, as a permission. He kissed her softly, briefly, with great care, and then pulled back far enough to look at her. "All right," he said. "Better than all right," she said. He smiled, a real smile, the kind she had not seen from him in their months together, broad and unguarded and entirely unself-conscious. And she felt it land in the center of her chest like a match being struck, warm and sudden and absolutely right. She was not going to allow herself to fall carelessly. She had fallen carelessly once, and it had nearly ended her in a Wyoming winter, and she was too intelligent and too hard-won to repeat that mistake. But there was nothing careless about what was growing between her and Owen Keene. It was careful and rooted and built on the kind of knowing that only comes from working alongside someone day after day, watching how they handle frustration, how they treat the animals, how they move through difficulty, whether they are the same person at the end of a hard day as they were at the beginning. He was. She had tested it all spring without meaning to, and he came through every test not because he was performing steadiness but because he was genuinely steady. She trusted that. She trusted him. And she understood that trust was a more solid foundation than any emotion, because trust was not something you fell into, it was something you built, board by board, each one nailed with evidence. Through the summer they worked the homestead together, and the place transformed under their combined effort in ways that made Matilda sometimes stop in the middle of a task and look around at it with something that took her a moment to identify as pride. Not just the quiet kind she had felt all winter in the act of mere survival, but a bigger, expanding kind, the pride of watching something grow under your hands into something real and lasting. Owen had an eye for cattle. He rode into Laramie City in July and came back with 2 additional cows negotiations she had not been present for but whose terms he reported down to the last cent, which she appreciated. And by August, the small herd was productive enough to sell a portion of the output at the weekly market. She kept the accounting in a ledger she had bought in the spring, and the numbers, while not comfortable, were moving in the right direction for the first time since she had arrived in Wyoming. One afternoon in August, a man she did not know came to the property line and Matilda watched from the garden as Owen walked out to meet him, and the conversation was brief, and she could not hear the words but she could read Owen's posture relaxed, not confrontational, firm. The man left without coming onto the property. She waited until dinner to ask, "Who was that?" Owen set down his fork. "Man named Briggs, he works for Dole's outfit." She went still. "What did he want?" "Said Dole's willing to pay you for the east parcels, cash." "And what did you tell him?" Owen picked up his fork again. "I told him the parcels weren't for sale and the matter was settled in court, and if Dole sent anyone else to have this conversation on your property, they could have it with the county sheriff instead." She looked at him for a long moment. "You said your property. It is your property. Some men in your position would start calling it our." He met her eyes. "It's yours, Matilda. I work here. It's yours. That's not something I'd ever blurry." She nodded slowly. She felt something warm and considerable move through her chest. She said, "I appreciate that." "I know," he said. But the truth was that somewhere in the course of that long summer she had begun thinking of it as something shared. Not in any legal sense. Not yet. Not something she was ready to name aloud. But in the cellular, instinctive sense that the land and the work and the days on it had become inseparable from his presence, and that she could not imagine looking at the north field or the south pasture or the stovepipe he had cleared in February without seeing him in it. She also thought, in the quiet hours, about what she was. She was still legally married to George Carter. A woman in the Wyoming Territory in 1880 could not simply decide a marriage was over because her husband had abandoned her and ridden south with another woman. The law had its own rhythms, slow and indifferent. She had written a letter to an attorney in Laramie City in the spring, asking about the process for seeking abandonment on the grounds of desertion. The attorney had written back to say that the grounds were solid, but the process would require filing in the district court and could take the better part of a year. She told Owen about the letter in September, sitting on the porch in the cooling evening air, because she would not be dishonest with him about her circumstances, and because she believed he deserved to know the full shape of things. He listened. He did not look alarmed or troubled. He looked at her with the same clear, quiet attention he always gave her. When she finished, he said, "Is there anything I can do to help with the process?" "No. It's something the court handles on its own time." "Then I'll wait," he said simply. She looked at him. "You make it sound easy." "It is easy," he said. "I know what I want." She felt the weight and the warmth of those 5 words settle around her like something permanent. "What do you want?" she asked, and her voice was steady because she was Matilda Carter and she asked for things plainly. He looked at her, and in the evening light his eyes were very warm and very sure. "You," he said. "Whatever that looks like, whatever pace it needs to go, I'm not going anywhere." She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, and they sat in the going dark like that, and she thought, this is what it feels like when a person means what they say. That fall was rich in the ordinary ways that felt, after the deprivation of the previous winter, almost luxuriant. The cattle were producing. The garden had been good enough to put up a substantial amount of preserved food for the coming winter, more than enough. Owen had added a second room to the cabin through September, properly built, with real board walls and a window that actually sealed. And the homestead was beginning to look like what George had promised it would be when he told her about it in Cincinnati, except that it was made by real labor and real intention rather than in the gilded air of an imaginary future. She rode into Laramie City in October to meet with the attorney about the desertion proceedings, and the attorney told her that based on the evidence of Harris's witness account and the time elapsed, the district judge was likely to grant the petition at the November session. She rode home with the news sitting light and important in her chest. She told Owen at supper. He put down his cup and looked at her. "November," he said. "November," he nodded. He was quiet for a moment and then he said carefully, "Matilda, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, nothing changes between us. You don't owe me anything, not a single thing. You understand that?" "Yes," she said. "Ask me." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and set something on the table between them. It was a ring, a simple silver ring, not elaborate, not expensive, with a small piece of turquoise set in it that caught the light in a way that made her breath stop for just a moment. "I bought this in Laramie City back in July," he said. "I didn't plan to show it to you this soon, but I want you to know that my intentions are clear and they have been for a while. When you're free and when you're ready, if you ever are, I'd like to marry you. And if you're never ready, I will still be here. I'm not offering this as a condition." She looked at the ring on the table, and she looked at him, and she thought about the woman she had been in November of 1879 alone in a breaking-down cabin with 4 thin cows and a husband who had chosen not to come home, burning through her supplies and her hope in careful, rationed portions, talking to herself in the dark just to hear a human voice. She thought about what she had said to herself in January. "You are not going to let this be the end." She had survived. And survival had led her here, to this kitchen, to this man, to this ring on the table with its small piece of turquoise that was the color of the Wyoming sky in the brief, beautiful window between seasons. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her and something in him steadied and softened at the same time. He picked up the ring and came around the table and she stood from her chair and he took her left hand in both of his, careful and warm. "Matilda Carter," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Owen Keene, yes." He put the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly. He had measured. She realized, somehow, which was so entirely like him that she would have laughed if her throat had not been so full of something she could only call the purest, most uncomplicated happiness she had ever experienced. He pulled her close and held her, and she put her face against his shoulder and breathed him in wood smoke and leather, and the particular clean scent of him that she had come to know as absolutely as she knew the sound of the wind off the mountains. And they stood in the kitchen of the homestead she had kept alive through the worst winter in 15 years, and it felt like arriving. The November session of the district court granted Matilda's petition for dissolution of the marriage on grounds of desertion, exactly as the attorney had predicted. She received the official document on the 22nd of November, and she stood outside the courthouse with it in her hands and felt the clean, definitive quality of something closing behind her, a door that needed to be shut. Owen was waiting by the horses. When she came down the courthouse steps with the paper, he knew without asking, just by the way she was carrying herself, upright, free, certain. He came forward and took her hands, and she showed him the paper, and he looked at it briefly, and then at her. "Free," she said. "Free," he agreed. They were married on the 7th of March, 1881, in the small white church in Laramie City, with Harris and his wife as witnesses and the minister who had come down from Cheyenne for the month. Matilda wore a blue dress she had made herself through the winter evenings, good wool serge in a color that matched the turquoise in her ring, and Owen wore his good coat and a clean white shirt, and he looked at her when she came into the church with an expression so full and unguarded that Harris's wife reached for her handkerchief before the vows had even begun. She said her vows in the plain, clear voice she had used all her life for important things, the same voice she had used to say, "You are not going to let this be the end," in the dark of January, the same voice she had used to say yes in the kitchen when he asked. And when Owen said his vows, he said them looking directly at her, not at the floor or the middle distance, but at her, and she held his gaze the whole time because she was Matilda Carter, and she had never once looked away from what mattered. When the minister said the words were done and Owen kissed her, it was the same as that first kiss in June, warm and careful and entirely full of intention. And it was also different, because now it was the beginning of something that had its own legal gravity, its own permanence, its own claim on the future. They drove the wagon home in the afternoon, through the March cold and the brief pale sunshine, and when they came over the rise and the homestead appeared below them in the golden late light, the cabin with its added room, the barn with its repaired walls, the south field with the fence Owen had reset, the north field where they would put in the summer crop, Matilda felt the whole accumulated weight of the previous 2 years settle and arrange itself into something she could call, without qualification, her life. Happy? He asked. Very, she said. He put his arm around her on the wagon seat, and she leaned into the warmth of him, and the horses knew the way home. The spring of 1881 brought a new project they had planned through the winter, a proper chicken coop and a run, which would expand the homestead's productivity and give Matilda a trading commodity. She could work at the Laramie City Market independently of the cattle operation. Owen built the coop through April and May, and she furnished it with 16 laying hens and 2 roosters by June, and by August she was selling eggs at the weekly market and had begun a friendship with a Shoshone woman named Pearl who sold beadwork at the same market, and who moved through the world with a quiet, intelligent humor that Matilda found immediately compelling. Pearl had come to Laramie City with her husband, a man who worked for a freighting company on the North Route, and she spoke English that was precise and careful, learned through years of necessity rather than choice. The injustices Pearl lived within were not things Matilda could fix or erase. The treaty violations that had pushed Pearl's people onto diminished lands, the daily navigations of a world that had been reshaped by people who believed that reshaping the world was their right. But she could listen. She could be honest. She could conduct herself at the market with the same plainness and fairness she brought to every exchange, and she could make it clear, through repeated small actions, that she considered Pearl's presence as legitimate as her own. They became friends in the gradual, tested way that real friendship formed on the frontier, not through sudden declarations, but through accumulated proof. Matilda gave Pearl the better end of a trade more than once. Pearl gave Matilda knowledge about the land, about plants that grew on the slopes she had never properly read, about weather signs and water sources. It was the kind of mutual exchange that did not require anyone to be grateful, just to be present and honest, and both women were built for that. Owen liked Pearl immediately, which Matilda registered as further evidence of her good judgment in marrying him. He treated her husband Eli with the same directness he brought to any man worth respecting, which was to say he spoke to him plainly and listened when Eli spoke. And over the course of the fall, the 4 of them shared a meal together more than once at the homestead, while the market season wound down. It was at one of these dinners, in late October of 1881, that Matilda mentioned quietly to Pearl that she suspected she was pregnant. Pearl looked at her with a direct, warm gaze. How long? 2 months, I think, maybe 3. You feel it? I feel different, Matilda said. Not sick, just different, like there's more of me than there was. Pearl smiled. Yes, she said, that is how it begins. Matilda told Owen that same evening, after Pearl and Eli had driven home in their wagon with the lantern swinging at the tail, and the homestead was quiet and firelit and entirely their own. She had been holding the information for 2 weeks, certain enough to know but not quite ready to say aloud, because saying aloud made it real in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. She sat down across from him at the table and said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her. He always heard her before she finished the sentence, or so it seemed. Something in his face shifted with attentiveness before she had even formed the words. "All right," he said. "I'm going to have a baby." The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds, and then Owen Keene, who was a man of great composure in most circumstances, put both hands over his face and made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else, something raw and astonished and deeply, overwhelmingly glad. He put his hands down and looked at her with eyes that were bright in a way she had never seen them, and he said, "When? Spring, April or May, I think." He came around the table and pulled her up from her chair and held her carefully, as if she were already something more precious than she had been an hour ago, which she supposed she was. She could feel him breathing deep, steadying breaths, and she put her hand on the back of his neck and felt him come back to himself. "You all right?" he asked, voice low against her hair. "I'm very all right," she said. "And you're happy about it?" "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He pulled back enough to look at her, and his face was entirely open, every guard down, just him and the full weight of his feeling and no attempt to manage it. "Matilda," he said, "I am so happy it scares me." "Don't be scared," she said. "We are good at getting through hard things." "This isn't a hard thing." "No," she agreed, "but if it were, we would still get through it." He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her mouth slowly, warmly. She held on to him in the firelight of the homestead that she had built and fought for and kept alive through the worst winter in 15 years, and she thought, this is what was on the other side. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was cold, but nothing like the winter she had survived alone. And with Owen, she passed it in an entirely different register, with company, with warmth, with the particular richness of a small life well arranged against the elements. He built a larger woodpile than they needed, partly from habit and partly because he would not permit himself to be underprepared for a season that had already shown him what it could do to a person. She sewed baby things by firelight, small quilted squares, a knitted hat in cream wool, a set of flannel wrappings, and he would sometimes put down whatever he was reading and watch her work, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on a man before, something whole and quiet and full. She told him things during that winter that she had not told anyone, things about the first winter alone. Not the facts of it, which she had told him that first night over bean stew, but the interior of it, what it had felt like to lie awake at 2 in the morning when the temperature was 30 below and listen to the wind, and think about whether she was actually going to survive until morning. The strange calm that had come over her in January, which she now understood was the calm of someone who had stopped being afraid of the worst outcome, because the worst outcome was no longer abstract. It was present, immediate, and she had decided to oppose it without drama. She told him about talking to herself, about the things she had said in the dark, about "you are not going to let this be the end." He listened to all of it, every word. He did not flinch, and he did not look away, and he did not try to reframe any of it into something more bearable for him to hear. He just held all of it, the weight and the cold of it, and the long, hard, specific truth of what she had carried. And she felt the relief of being completely known by another person as one of the most profound physical sensations of her life. When she finished, the fire had burned low and the room was dark except for the ember glow, and Owen reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand and held it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "You are the strongest person I have ever known." "I was just trying to stay alive," she said. "That is what strength is," he said. "That is exactly what it is." She tightened her fingers in his. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "I'm glad you came up that road." "So am I," he said, "every single day." The baby came in the early morning hours of the 22nd of May, 1882, with Pearl at her side, because Pearl had attended births before, and Matilda trusted her more than the doctor in town who she had heard described by 3 separate women as either distracted or unreliable. Owen was in the next room and she could hear him there, the creak of his boots on the floor, the occasional low sound he made when he heard her working through a hard contraction, the long silences when she was quiet. Pearl was calm and precise and spoke in low, steady tones throughout, and she told Matilda when to push and when to rest, and when the end was close. And at 5:43 in the morning by the clock on the wall, the baby arrived into Pearl's waiting hands in the first gray light of a May dawn. A boy. Owen came through the door when Pearl called him, and Matilda was propped against the pillows with the baby at her chest, wrapped in the cream wool blanket she had knitted through February, and the boy had his eyes open, already dark and very new and very intent, looking at the world with the slightly suspicious expression of someone who has just arrived and is still deciding what to make of the situation. Owen sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son for a long moment without speaking. Then he reached out and touched the boy's hand, very gently, one finger, and the baby's hand closed around it with that involuntary grip that was ancient and certain and remarkable. "Hello," Owen said, his voice very rough. Matilda watched her husband's face and thought, "Every hard thing I have ever gone through led me to this exact room on this exact morning." She did not say it because some things did not need to be said, but she knew it completely. "What do we name him?" Owen asked, looking up at her. They had talked about names. She had a list in the ledger. She looked at the baby, at his dark, observant eyes and the strong set of his small jaw and the way he was already gripping Owen's finger as if he had decided to hold on and intended to stick with that decision. And she said, "James." "James Keene," Owen said. He tried it out, let it settle. "James Owen Keene," she said. He looked at her with the full weight of that, and his eyes were bright again the way they had been when she told him she was pregnant, that open, unmanaged gladness. "Yes," he said. Pearl stayed through the morning and made coffee and a proper breakfast and checked on the baby with experienced, thorough hands. And by midday the little homestead was quiet, and the 3 of them, Matilda and Owen and small James Owen Keene, were arranged in the long light of a Wyoming May, and it was as good a day as Matilda had ever known. The summer of 1882 was full and warm, and James grew with the appetite and insistence of a person with things to do. He was dark-haired like Owen and had Matilda's gray eyes, which Owen liked to point out whenever the light caught them at the right angle. He was alert and loud and entirely healthy, and carrying him on her hip while she worked the garden, Matilda felt the continuity of her own life in a way she had not before felt the winter she had survived, and the spring that had followed, and the full branching growth of everything since. All of it leading to this warm August morning with the mountains blue in the distance, and her son reaching for the pole beans with one determined fist. Owen had taken on an additional cattle operation that spring, partnering with a rancher named Teller who owned the property 3 miles east and needed a capable hand willing to work on shares rather than straight wage. The arrangement increased their income substantially, and by the end of the summer they had paid down the debt on the land and had money in reserve for the first time, real money, the kind that offered options rather than just continuity. One evening in September, Owen came back from Teller's operation with the easy, tired satisfaction of a man who has done a day's work and knows its value, and he sat at the table while Matilda served dinner and James banged a wooden spoon against the edge of his blanket on the floor, and Owen said, "Teller's offered to sell me the eastern portion of his acreage, the part that runs along our north boundary." She looked up. "How much?" he told her. She did the calculation with the reserve they had. "We could manage it," she said. "We could," he agreed, "with 2 more seasons of the cattle share and what you're getting from the eggs. Do you want it?" He thought about it. "I want to know what you think first." She appreciated that he asked. She always did. "I think the north boundary is the weakest part of this operation," she said. "If we own to the east line, it gives us access to the water source on Teller's Creek, which is better than our well in a dry year, and it's good grazing land, better than the south pasture. That's what I think too." Then I think we should buy it." They bought it in October, and the homestead became a proper ranch. 47 acres with access to the creek and room to run twice the current herd. Owen surveyed the new land on horseback the first morning it was theirs, riding the boundaries in the early light while Matilda watched from the porch with James on her hip. And she felt the expansion of it, not just the land but the possibility of it, like breathing deeper than she had in years. The year 1883 brought dry spring, and a summer that was harder than expected. 3 ranchers in the area lost cattle to disease, and one gave up entirely and sold to a large cattle company from Denver that was buying up smaller operations throughout the territory. Owen and Matilda watched this carefully. They had made choices designed to protect against the scale of vulnerability that the smaller neighbors had suffered: the creek access, the diversified income between cattle and egg production, and the small amount of hay they had started selling, and those choices held. They did not lose cattle. They did not lose ground. But the summer also brought a circumstance that tested something different. A man came to the homestead on a Tuesday in July, a man Matilda did not recognize, who rode a nervous horse and had the look of someone delivering information he would prefer not to. He asked if she was Matilda Carter Keene, and she said she was, and he told her that George Carter had died in Colorado in January of that year, of a fever, and that a woman named Clara, who had been with him, had engaged an attorney to determine whether there were any claims on his estate. Matilda looked at this man for a long moment. Then she said, "I have a dissolution document from the Wyoming District Court from November of 1880. I have no claim on anything of George Carter's estate and no interest in pursuing one. You can tell the attorney that." The man nodded and rode away. She went inside and stood at the kitchen table for a moment. Owen came in from the barn and found her standing there. He looked at her face and came across the room without asking, stood close. "What was that?" she told him. He listened. When she finished, he said, "You all right?" She took stock of herself honestly, the way she always did. "Yes," she said. "I feel nothing much actually, just the end of a thing that ended a long time ago." "That's grief in its own way," he said. "Maybe." She looked at him. "Mostly I feel that I'm exactly where I should be and that this," she gestured at the kitchen, "the window showing the yard, the distant pasture, is real. And he was a story I got out of." Owen nodded. He put his hand on her face, briefly, warm. "Yes," he said. "You got out of it." She covered his hand with hers. "Because of me," she said. "And then also, very much because of you." The years settled around the ranch at Laramie like layers of good soil. 1884 brought a second pregnancy that resulted in a girl they named Ruth Eleanor Keene, born in late November with a full head of dark hair and the kind of focused expression that suggested she had arrived with opinions already formed. James was 2.5 and regarded his sister with the mixture of interest and uncertainty that small children brought to all new developments, carefully at first. Then with growing enthusiasm when it became clear she was going to be a permanent and increasingly interesting feature of his world. Owen built a proper addition to the house through the summer of 1884, 2 new rooms and a real front porch with a railing. And Matilda put flower boxes along the porch railing in the spring of 1885 and planted marigolds and prairie roses. And the homestead that had once been a single breaking-down room with a patched roof and a frozen well had become something that people who drove past on the road below would sometimes slow down to look at. Not because it was grand, but because it had the particular beauty of a place where people were genuinely living. They hired a young man named Caleb in the spring of 1885 to help with the cattle operation, as the herd had grown to a size that exceeded what 2 people and occasional borrowed labor could properly manage. Caleb was 19 years old and serious in that anxious way of young men who are working hard to prove themselves, and Owen gave him clear instruction and honest feedback without condescension, and Matilda fed him dinner 3 times a week as part of the wage arrangement. By fall, Caleb had become something between an employee and a fixture, and James followed him around with open reverence while Ruth observed everything from her post on the porch, with the considering eyes she had inherited from both parents. Owen and Matilda had fallen into the rhythms that long-married people found, not the comfortable blurring of two people who had stopped seeing each other, but the particular depth of two people who had survived things together and come out the other side still choosing the same view. They argued sometimes because they were both direct and both had opinions, and their arguments had the quality of real arguments, fully invested, then genuinely resolved. She had never once walked away from a conflict with Owen feeling unheard, which was something she would not have known to value before she knew him, because she had not known it was possible. They still talked in the evenings on the porch, when the children were asleep and the summer dark was full of cricket sound, and the stars were doing what Wyoming stars always did. They had been talking since that first night over bean stew, and the conversation had never stopped, had never run out, had only grown richer and wider and more comfortable with its own pauses. One evening in the fall of 1886, when James was 4 and Ruth was almost 2, and the ranch was operating at a scale that would have been unimaginable to the woman standing alone in a breaking-down cabin in November of 1879. Matilda sat on the porch in the cooling evening, and Owen sat beside her, and they listened to the silence that was not empty but full of the life they had made. The life still going on inside the house and out in the pasture and in the town below and in the entire, wide, impossible landscape of the Wyoming Territory. "Do you ever think about what it could have been?" she asked, not with melancholy, with genuine curiosity. "How do you mean?" "If things had been different, if George hadn't left, or if you had ridden a different road in February." Owen was quiet for a moment, considering it honestly the way he always did. "No," he said finally, "not much. It would be a waste of time thinking about roads I didn't ride. But if you did think about it," he looked at her, "then I would think that I am very glad I rode that one, and that I am very glad you were standing on that porch when I came up the hill. And that everything that happened before that morning, however hard, led to the exact life I am living, and I would not trade it. Not one day of it." She looked at him, at the man who had come up her road with 2 canteens and a pack horse and an honest offer of labor, who had ridden to Cheyenne for her paperwork and fought her boundary dispute, and asked her to marry him with a turquoise ring he had been carrying since July, who had held his son for the first time in the gray light of a May morning, and said hello, who had stood in her kitchen while she told him about the worst winter of her life, and held every word of it without flinching. "Owen," she said, "yes, I love you." He looked at her for a moment with the full, open expression that was entirely his own, unguarded, genuine, abundant. "Matilda," he said, "I have loved you since you handed me that coffee in February and looked at me like you were still deciding whether I was worth the tin cup." She laughed, a real laugh, the full-throated kind, and he laughed too, and the sound of it went out into the Wyoming night, and she thought, here, right here, this is where the story is. In the spring of 1887, she rode into Laramie City to the market and met Pearl at her usual spot, and they talked while James ran the length of the market square and Ruth sat in the wagon eating a piece of cornbread with extreme concentration. Pearl had news her husband Eli's company had given him a permanent route that would keep them in the Laramie area indefinitely, which meant Pearl was settling, building something that would stay. "Good," Matilda said. "Good, I'm glad." Pearl looked at her with that direct, warm gaze. "You look well, Matilda." "I am well," Matilda said, and meant it without reservation. "Better than well," Pearl said. "Better than well," she agreed. She drove home through the afternoon with James beside her and Ruth asleep against her arm, the mountains blue and enormous in the west, and the road she had traveled so many times now familiar in its every turn and dip. The bend by the cottonwood stand, the rise where the homestead first appeared on the hill, the track down to the gate with the old rusted hinge post that was still there, that she had never replaced because it was the first thing she had ever pointed Owen toward. He was in the yard when she drove in, working with Caleb on something with the fence, and he looked up when he heard the wagon and raised a hand. That same gesture he had made from the road the first morning, not quite a wave, just the acknowledgement of her right to be there. Except now it meant something different. Now it meant, "I see you. I'm glad you're home." She raised her hand back. James jumped from the wagon before it fully stopped, which he knew he was not supposed to do and did anyway because he was 4 and could not always be argued with on this point. And Owen caught him by the collar with one easy hand without even looking, which he had perfected over 2 years of James being exactly this person. "You know better," Owen said to his son. "I forgot," James said. "You didn't forget. I was in a hurry." "What for?" James thought about this. "To see you," he said, with the disarming honesty of small children. Owen looked down at him for a moment, and his face did the thing it did when the feeling was too large to manage, that bright openness. He set the boy down and ruffled his hair. "All right," he said. "That's a decent reason." Ruth woke up and demanded to be lifted from the wagon with the authority that had characterized her since birth, and Matilda lifted her and she immediately reached for Owen, and he took her, and the 4 of them moved toward the house in the late afternoon light, Caleb heading back to the fence, James already narrating something about a dog he had seen in town, Ruth examining the button on Owen's coat with profound interest. Matilda paused at the porch steps and looked back at the yard, the barn, the fence, the south pasture where the cattle were grazing in the golden hour light, the north land they had bought from Teller, the creek glinting somewhere beyond the tree line. She looked at all of it and she thought of February 1880, standing at her pump in the cold, handing a cup to a stranger, making the calculation that he was worth the trust. She thought of the letter she had written to the attorney, the ring on the table, Pearl's hands delivering her son into the world, the winter that should have ended her story and didn't. She had survived the kind of winter that ended other people's stories. She had stood in the dark of it and told herself she would not let it be the end. And she had been right, because here was what was on the other side, the barn full of cattle, the porch with the marigolds, the boy who ran everywhere instead of walking, the girl who held opinions since birth, and the man with the steady brown eyes who had come up the road and asked for water and stayed to build a life. Owen was in the doorway holding Ruth on his hip, watching her stand in the yard with the particular patience that was one of his finest qualities. "You coming in?" he said. "In a minute," she said. He waited. He was good at that. She turned and looked at the mountains one more time, the long, blue, permanent line of them against the sky, the most beautiful and uncompromising thing she had ever seen, the view that had anchored her through everything. She breathed the air, which was cold and clean and smelled of Wyoming evening, which smelled like everything she had fought to keep. Then she went inside. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and James had already decided he needed a story about the dog he had seen in town to be relayed to his parents in full. And Ruth was patting Owen's face with both hands in the way she did when she had something to tell him, and had not yet acquired the vocabulary. Matilda hung her coat on the peg by the door and moved to the stove to start supper, and Owen appeared at her side and said, quietly, under the noise of the children, "Good day." "Very good," she said. He leaned and pressed a kiss to her temple, brief and warm, while Ruth protested being temporarily displaced from his full attention, and James reached the part of his story where the dog had nearly knocked over a barrel of apples outside the general store. Matilda stirred the pot on the stove and listened to her family and looked out the window at the dark coming in over the mountains, and she felt the extraordinary, ordinary, earned abundance of the life she was living. 3 years later, in the spring of 1890, Wyoming was granted statehood. The territory that had held her through the worst and the best of her life became something named and official on a map, a state with boundaries and a constitution, and critically, a state that had included women's suffrage in its territorial law since 1869 and carried it forward into statehood. Matilda read about this in the Laramie newspaper on a cool April morning and felt it matter in a way that was both abstract and personal. She was 35 years old and she could vote. That was something. That was real. Owen was reading the same paper across the table, and he looked up and met her eyes, and they understood each other without words, as they had increasingly learned to do over the decade of their marriage, and he said, "You'll be at the front of the line." "Yes," she said, "I will." They had a third child that year, another boy, born in August of 1890, whom they named Daniel. He arrived easier than James had and louder than Ruth. And James was 8, and Ruth was 5, and both of them regarded this newcomer with the assurance of older siblings who have already established their positions in the household and are willing to be generous from that position of security. Owen built a second barn through that summer because the operation had grown to a point where the original structure was genuinely insufficient, and Caleb, who was 24 by then and had become invaluable, helped design it with the knowledge he had accumulated in 5 years of working the ranch. Matilda ran the household and the egg operation and the bookkeeping, and increasingly she was the one other women in the area came to when they needed help with their own accounting, a thing that had begun with one neighbor asking a question and grown, by 1890, into something she took modest but real satisfaction in. Pearl and Eli's presence in Laramie had become permanent, and Ruth had taken on Pearl with the thoroughness of a child who had decided on a person and intended to stay decided. Pearl taught Ruth things about plants, about the land, about patience, and Matilda watched this friendship form across the usual barriers of the frontier and felt that it was one of the things she had managed correctly in her life, to be the kind of person who created a space where that friendship was possible. One evening in October of 1890, with the statehood settled and the new century visibly approaching in the way that history sometimes telegraphs itself, Matilda and Owen sat on the porch after the children were in bed and looked at the stars. Daniel was 10 weeks old and sleeping for longer stretches now, and the older two were asleep without drama, and the night was very quiet. "Tell me something," Owen said. It was a thing he said sometimes, had said for years, when he wanted to hear her think out loud. It was not a demand. It was an invitation. It was one of the things she loved most about him. She thought about what to tell him. There were many things she could choose. She thought about the decade behind them, all of it, the boundary dispute, the ring on the table, James arriving in the May dawn, Ruth's first opinionated word, Caleb learning to read a herd the way Owen had taught him, the new barn going up through the summer, Daniel in her arms with that new person gravity and smell. She thought about February 1880 coming up the road. She thought about January 1879, alone in the dark talking to herself. "I'm happy," she said. It was the simple thing, the truest thing. "I'm happy, Owen. Not the way I thought happiness worked when I was young, not the loud, easy kind that George Carter promised. The real kind. The kind that's built from things that cost you something." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. I know you know," she said. "That's why I told you." He reached over and took her hand as he had done 10 years ago on the road from Laramie City in the evening light, and she held on as she had done then and had been doing ever since. The stars over Wyoming were what they had always been, dense and absolute and unreasonably beautiful. The same stars she had looked at through the single window of the breaking-down cabin in January of 1879, when she did not know that Owen Keene existed, or that a turquoise ring was waiting in the future, or that the worst thing that had ever happened to her was also the beginning of the best. She had survived the kind of winter that ended other people's stories. She had come out the other side and stood on a porch and handed a stranger a cup of coffee, and the stranger had turned out to be the kind of man who listened to everything she said and held all of it carefully, and she had been brave enough to trust that. And here, 10 years and 3 children and 47 acres and one successful ranch and a real porch with marigold boxes and a front door that properly shut, here was the rest of the story. It was a good story. It was, she thought, looking at the stars with Owen's hand warm in hers, a very good story, and it was nowhere near finished. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the Wyoming night under the impossible weight of stars. And the land was quiet and the house was warm behind them, and everything, every hard, cold, improbable, earned thing, had led exactly here. Here, where she intended to remain.